Well, welcome everybody, and welcome back to another 1350 interview. Today, we're joined by Professor Michelle Brown, who will be with us actually in a couple of days in Monkwearmouth, delivering the Monkwearmouth Lecture. Michelle, do you want to introduce yourself and your background and how it is you've come to know so much about our favourite chap, the Venerable Bede?
I like Bede, I'm still learning. Yeah, I guess it's kind of a bit in the DNA. I was taken at the age of 4 by my Northumbrian mother and my Irish father to see the Lindisfarne Gospels in the British Library. And Dad put me up on his shoulders to look down into the Snow White's coffin, and it just drew me in. And I went home and wrote in my little girl diary that instead of being an astronaut, I was going to be a librarian and try and help civilization that way. My granddad on my mother's side was a Mackem. His name was Billy Crow, and they came from St Peter's, Monkwearmouth parish, in actual fact, but they walked down in the Jarrow Marches and stayed to find work on the East India Docks in London, which is why I'm a Hiberno Northumbrian trapped in a South East London accent. So I guess it was always inevitable that I was going to be drawn to the area, and in my research, I try to honour the dead dudes and work to serve the living. And past, present, and future are very much joined up together in my take on human history and my identity and that of my society, and how I sit in relation to the communion of saints and to God. And so I tend to research and write about things that I find uplifting, encouraging. It's like think on the good. It's not glossing over the fact that this early period that we're going to be talking about today, the 7th and 8th century, it's not a fairy tale fantasy period full of figures who don't really come from the same place as us. It's about real people with real situations of danger, dilemma, and doubt, real pains, real joys, real loves. And looking at their experience of their world, I think can be often very useful in considering some of the ways in which we've got to where we are, and help equip us to think about where we're going and to help make choices. And the reason that I wanted to write about Bede in particular, having had a long relationship with Monkwearmouth Jarrow, with Lindisfarne, and with the whole of the Northumbrian area, is that to my mind, there's a lot about it that we can benefit from considering again now. That one of the things I admire most about Bede is his ability to engage in joined-up thinking and the long view. And I think that's something that we're all of us feeling a bit of a lack of now, both in aspects of our culture, our attention span as we move deeper into the electronic environment, and also our politics, our statesmanship, whether it be within the state or within the faith. And so I think there's a lot to be learnt there. The other thing I think that attracts me particularly to this period is the fact it's a time of great change and transformation. The global superpower of the day, the Western Roman Empire, had crashed and burned. We'd gone into a reverse form of Brexit, in which we'd actually forcibly been cast off from mainland Europe. And we were in a situation where many new incoming population groups and many existing, often quite ancient population groups were having to find new ways of living alongside one another and of collaborating and forming new cultural and political expressions. So, in a way, what comes out of the mess? And in this period, what comes out of the mess most strongly for me isn't empires re-emerging, it isn't governments taking control, it isn't bully boy protectionist racketeers. It's men and women, and sometimes children, actually stepping aboard the boat with no oars to go wherever their God, whom they've often only just heard about the concept of a single God, but to serve him. They step aboard the boat with no oars and they go wherever there's work to be done. And in one of the ages that was the most dangerous in terms of war, famine, plague, etc., far more dangerous than COVID, they were the ones that put themselves on the line, and they transform these islands at the edge of the then known world, from a sort of mystical and almost barbarous state into one of the most learned, one of the most legally responsible, one of the most concerned areas with social justice, and one of the most vibrant cultures. And we're transformed from an outpost of a remote empire into a series of nation states: England, Ireland, Pickland and Scotland, Wales, Cornwall, the Isle of Man, and all of these new states working together and becoming part of a new and more diverse Europe. And Bede, above all, shines forth as one of the greatest thinkers of the post-Roman age. And if it hadn't have been for him and for Monkwearmouth and for Jarrow, for Lindisfarne and some of the other important early centres in Northumbria, we would indeed have gone into a dark age. But what we'd say now is, when we weren't in the dark ages, it was a time of illumination, and some of the great manuscripts from the region at that time, I think, illustrate that, and Bede was one of the biggest architects of them.
Wonderful. So I wonder if you can settle a great debate between Monkwearmouth and Jarrow.
I'm not going in that. You're not trapping me on that one. Go on, you can
I'm
try.
going to
Go
ask
on.
you,
Go on, try.
where did Bede spend the most time?
We don't know. We don't know, Tim. What we
So
know is
Monkwearmouth.
that we know that this is the 30th. That he loved them both, I'm sure, in different and complementary ways, because they are very different places, but they were a twin monastery, as we know, and that is very, very unusual. It's not just there's one monastery there and another one there, and they're related because they had similar founders or the same founder. They are a twin monastery. As Bede says, they are two places with but one will. Now, I'll come on to why that is important, but you've got these two very important centres, one at the mouth of the River Wear and one at the mouth of the River Tyne. And of course, Monkwearmouth is the first to be founded in 674, and it's dedicated to St. Peter, the Rock, the Prince of the Apostles. Upon Peter will I build my church, said Christ. And the other, founded in 681 and dedicated to St. Paul, the great sort of twin apostle with Peter, is of course at Jarrow. And so you've got two monasteries set right on the most important centres of communication, the River Wear and the River Tyne, towards their mouths, near ancient Roman trading forts, etc. And the reason that we have them, and the reason they're so important, is that there was a young man called Benedict Biscop, as we know, who is possibly came from noble background. Then the name Biscop, or Badeking, which is his Old English name, occurs in the King lists of Lindsey, which is the East Anglian area that was settled by some of the earlier Germanic settlers who came from the Angles, who came from that particular part of northern Germany and southern Scandinavia. And he is fired with an enthusiasm for the new religion. It's possible that Bede may have been related to him. What we know about Bede is that he was born, we think, in 673, so this is the 1350th anniversary of Bede's death this year. And when he was 7, his kinsmen, he probably doesn't say his parents, he said his kinsmen presented him to the new monastery that Benedict Biscop had founded, the first one at Monkwearmouth, St. Peter's. And the name Beda, Bede's name in Latin, Bedai in Old English, also occurs in the same East Anglian Lindsey King list as that of Benedict Badeking. So it's possible that they were slightly related, and that they came from the Anglian people. The name Lindisfarne, for example, we think means the travellers from Lindsey. So it's likely that they came over initially to East Anglia and then moved up further into what becomes known as Northumbria. So the little boy is presented. And what might that have been like? What is Benedict doing? Well, Benedict has travelled already on the continent. He's been through Gaul, he's travelled over the Alps, he's been to Rome, and ultimately he and his right-hand man, Abbot Ceolfrith, they travel between them 6 times to Rome. On one occasion, they take 84 men with them. And on the carts that they bring back with them, they are loaded with books, with paintings, with icons, probably with mosaics, all sorts of things, and relics of the saints. And they conceive of a vision of actually reconstructing some of the early Christian tradition here in their new homeland, what comes to be known, due to Bede, as England from the Angles. It could be Saxonland or Jutland, but no, because Bede was Anglian, we're known as English. And so Bede goes into this new monastery, which he says is built More Romanum. It's in the dressed stone of the work of giants that still litters the landscape around Hadrian's Wall and some of the great centres in Roman Britain that were still visible above ground. And we know from one of Bede's writings that as late as the 680s, that the Roman water system was still functioning in Carlisle. The fountains, the drainage systems, etc., were all still functioning. And Biscop builds St. Peter's and then St. Paul's in Jarrow in this revived style of monumental masonry with beautiful carved sculptures and with the walls adorned with these incredible images that he's brought back from the continent. But the most important thing that they brought back was the books, because think about the dissolution of the monasteries in the 16th century when Henry VIII was detached from Rome. There were people who went to him and said, well, Henry, there are all these incredible books in the monasteries that you've dissolved, and they're being used by tinkers and small boys to make the equivalent of paper aeroplanes, I don't know, vellum boats, and dress patterns and lining shoes and things. And Henry didn't invest in actually creating a national library to actually bring them all in. Well, the same occurred in the 7th century. People had tried to sop up what they could of the great intellectual works of the Greek and Roman past and of the early Christian church, but nobody would invest or was in a position to do that. Biscop and Ceolfrith go out there and they put together whatever they can. We think they salvage part of the great library of Cassiodorus. They salvage things from Rome. And if it hadn't been for them reconstructing that in Northumbria, the lights would have gone out, and it would have been so much harder for a lot of those works to then have been rediscovered and to influence Europe going forward. But they didn't just collect books and look at them on the shelves. They used them. They studied them. They've got incredible intellectual curiosity. And can you imagine the young boy Bede getting under everybody's feet at the age of 7 when he first goes in? He's on a massive building site and he's seeing stained glass being made. He's seeing molten glass being poured, and he gets interested in everything, the natural world around him. And one of the great books that he writes is an encyclopedia about the nature of things. Matter matters. He wants to know how the physical world ticks. And that starts him on a journey where not only is he deeply immersed in the beauty of worship and a deep faith and a love of study, but he's a scientist. He wants to know what makes the physical world tick. He wants to know about the past. He wants to know about human history. He wants to know about music. He likes pop songs. He writes music. He writes verse. He's one of the great pioneers of using our own language, Old English as it was for him, rather than a language of a big empire, be it Greek or Latin, although he knew those languages. And so, this is what forms Bede. And the thing to bear in mind is he goes into that monastery at Monkwearmouth in when he's 7 in 680, and at some point, fairly soon after, we think he goes with Ceolfrith to help start up the new one at Jarrow. After that, he would have had a relationship with both monasteries, and I'm sure he would have been at both of them on a very regular basis. They're only about 7 or 8 miles apart, isn't it? And so, he would have known both. He would have had a continuing relationship with both. He undoubtedly started at Monkwearmouth. He undoubtedly died at Jarrow. In between, the two monasteries with one will are a twin, and he is part of both. And the people he encountered there alongside him, and the world that they'd reconstructed, and the way in which they integrated that with the world of the Germanic paths from which they had come, and the world of the Celtic missionaries of Iona, Lindisfarne, and even the ancient British church and the Roman experience of Britain. All of that comes together, and they create a new vision. And it's only 40 years since Paulinus had come into Northumbria in 625 with a Christian princess from Kent to try and broker a marriage with the pagan king of Northumbria, the Germanic king Edwin. And it was a bit like the Wild West at that time in American terms. Within 40 years, Biscop, Ceolfrith, Bede, and monasteries such as Lindisfarne and Wilfrid's monasteries at Hexham, Ripon, and many, many others, Hills, Whitby, Hartlepool, all of these incredible places together had helped pagan kings who were basically warlords, relying upon booty, rapine, etc., and feasting, and a jolly good drinking session in the mead hall, and all your needs taken care of to ensure the loyalty of their war bands. They transformed them into responsible leaders of a people who embraced a new ethos, who freed slaves, who gave their wealth to the poor. And these were the people, the men and women in the monasteries, who provided whatever healthcare, education, diplomacy, and an administration that was available. It's an incredible transformation, and the young Bede was in there on the ground floor in the Mies van der Rohe building of its day at Monkwearmouth and then Jarrow, and he was at the forefront. And after he died in 735, everybody, even the Emperor Charlemagne, were clamouring to get copies of his works. And Wearmouth Jarrow together have to set themselves up as the most incredible publishing house in order to get all of these works, the history of the English church and people, the nature of time, how to calculate time, the nature of things, the life of St. Cuthbert in verse and in prose, commentaries on Mark, Luke, all sorts of incredible things. His work on the Bible, his study of the Bible, which helped us to have the purest version in Latin that was known, that came to be printed in the Counter-Reformation. When they came to print the Latin Bible, the Vulgate, in the 16th century, the scholars looked at as many copies of it as they could, and they found that the best, most reliable reconstruction of the work that Jerome did in Bethlehem in the 380s to produce a reliable Latin edition of the Bible, the Vulgate, were actually made at Monkwearmouth Jarrow and at Lindisfarne. And in my new book, I've managed to identify both Bede's handwriting in the Codex Amiatinus, one of 3 great single-volume Bibles made at Monkwearmouth Jarrow, and it was taken as a present to the Pope by Ceolfrith in 716. And that is the best work of scholarship in the Christian Church since Jerome, to actually preserve that work and to take it forward. And Bede's hand is there, and he is one of the great intellectual forces behind that. But he also wrote poetry. He wrote wonderful songs. He wrote about all of the complexities of human relationships and the pitfalls of politics and the joys of creativity and the beauty of worship. And so for me, he's an absolute polymath. And that's why I've called my new book Bede and the Theory of Everything, because modern scientists such as Einstein and Hawking said they think there should be a theory of everything in which you can you can explain how everything relates to it. But their work couldn't do it because they dealt with certain things like quantum and relativity, and they didn't have a spiritual dimension. But both of them acknowledged that without a spiritual dimension, you probably couldn't create a view of everything. And in his day, Bede did that. It's faith, art, science, the humanities, the natural world, and the spiritual dimensions of your relationship with God, all working together to give a theory of what makes the world tick and how the world functions in the present, in material ways, and how it sits within eternity. And so Bede, to my mind, is the most amazing thinker. And that little boy with his intellectual curiosity and his great hope and his passion is far from the dusty old monk that we might think of. And a tribute to him is he's the only person from these islands who's ever been known as venerable. Now, within the Catholic Church, as you know, the process of acknowledging people as saints back in the day, it was by popular acclaim. You were considered to be a very good thing. But when the Catholic Church bestow official sainthood upon Bede, he is venerable. He is the only doctor of the Church to have been produced in these islands. And he is the church father of England and to a certain extent of its neighbours. And so I think he's remarkable, and I think there are all sorts of things that we can look at and think about. And the amazing thing about Monkwearmouth and also about Jarrow is that they have retained so much of that early fabric. You look at the walls that Bede looked at, you look at the stained glass that he looked and wondered at as it was being made. You stand in the places where he stood. And at one point, only he and Chalfrith were alive to carry on saying the office throughout day and night because all of the others had died of plague. There's a lot to think about in Bede's life and the legacy that he's given us, and in the wonderful, wonderful sense of connection that you get when you go to Monkwearmouth and Jarrow, where the flame of faith has burnt for all those intervening centuries and where it burns bright today.
Definitely. So I think what we've decided then was Bede definitely favoured Monkwearmouth, and Jarrow was
Unless you're listening in
no,
Jarrow at the
yeah,
moment, yeah.
Jarrow was the add-on. No. I think that's really interesting. I think you touched on something there that that's kind of important. I think a lot of people might think of a monastery as a place of sanctuary and of solitude and being away from society and the culture, and that might very much be how they operate today, at least some of the ones that remain.
Yeah, it depends what order
But
you're part of. We tend to think of
yeah,
either Trappist monks who never speak or some of the other orders that are enclosed orders where you remain within the cloister. But back in the day we're talking about, whoever founded the monastery established its rule. Now, they
yeah,
might look at the rule of life that others had introduced, like St. Benedict's little rule for beginners or Columba's rule for the Columban Federation of Derry and Iona, etc. Or they might look at the rules of the Egyptian and other desert fathers, such as Basil and Pachomius, and they might put in their own common sense features as well. But whatever they were at this period, they weren't enclosed. They're places that interact on a daily basis with the outside world. As I say, they provide the schools, they provide the hospitals, they provide the travel lodges, accommodation for people travelling as well. And they're out and about. Again, there are differences from monastery to monastery. Lindisfarne wouldn't have operated
Yeah.
in quite the same way as Monkwearmouth and Jarrow. There's the eremitic idea of the Desert Fathers, where you're a group of rampant individuals living together in community, as hermits in community. And there's the more Roman military idea of Martin of Tours and others, that you have communal refectories, communal dormitories, which is a more kind of what we call Cenobitic, a communal life, on an almost military model of how you arrange, the buildings and everything. But whichever you were doing, you would have at that period a responsibility to actually provide aid and a pastoral care out into the immediate area around your monastery, but often quite a significant way further outside. And you would interact with kings and nobles, you would receive diplomats and other church people from abroad, from
Yeah.
east and west, and you would get involved in helping to stage the great G8 and G7 summits of the day and the great church councils. And I'm going to give you one little thing about your Monkwearmouth Jarrow perpetual, which one is more important. That is, I think, when Bede says, bit technical, but stick with me, when Bede says 2 places with but one will, I think the reason that Jarrow is founded in 681-2 to join St. Peter's at Monkwearmouth as an indivisible whole, one in 2 places, is because in 681 a big council took place in Constantinople, the 6th ecumenical council of the whole Christian church. And at this period we're part of the International Orthodox Church, okay, in this country. And we held the G7 summit prior to it in this country. 679, it was held at Hatfield outside of London. And part of the thing they'd got together to discuss at that big council and at the pre-summit in Hatfield was the fact that there were certain heresies and certain big controversies in churchmanship that is in danger of pulling the church apart. Yeah. And the big thing at that point was a thing called the monothelite controversy. Now, we don't seem to think we've got too much of a problem with it that time if you are a believer in Christianity. But what it meant was that people couldn't get their head round how Jesus could have been both human and divine. And so all sorts of heresies and schisms that, was he the adopted son of God? How did the relationship work? And this was really causing an awful lot of debate. And the conclusion at Hatfield in England, that was then adopted in Constantinople in 681, was that the 2 wills of Christ, human and divine, were totally indivisible. And the big proof of that was the nativity of Christ and the crucifixion of Christ, when the human will of Christ totally obeyed his divine will. Okay, and so from that point of onwards, you start getting depictions of the nativity and the Virgin of Child start being more popular, and the crucifixion with Christ on the cross start being more popular. And the big thing, the doctrine from that point onward, was that the 2 wills are indivisible and one, human and divine. Benedict Biscop had been part of the Hatfield negotiations. Who knows, they may even have been part of the Constantinople one. And he then founds the second monastery to join the first one, Monkwearmouth and Jarrow, 2 places with but one will. So if you try and actually separate them out now, you're trying to separate out the big symbol of Christ as the human and divine whole. It's a bit like Patrick and the 3-leaf shamrock.
Okay. Well, we'll go with that then.
Okay, good.
It's a lovely symbol for Christ's indivisibility. Sorry, I'm being attacked by a Labrador, so I'm going to push her down.
Oh, that's great.
So they've managed to find their way into the office. But I think what I was trying to, I guess what my question is, people's view of monasteries are of something. But the way you were talking about a little while ago about sort of the change that these places had on the political landscape and the the effect that it had on the pagan world surrounding it.
Mm.
I mean, pagan Britain wasn't a fun place to be, and I
Depends
think,
who you were. Yeah, if you had the money and the might is right, maybe.
yeah,
But you're not if
I
you were
think
on the receiving end of it.
so many people
And of course,
underestimate how much of the morality we now hold
mm,
comes from from Christendom and this idea
mm,
of Christian morality, I suppose.
mm, mm. Okay, well, a
Um,
few things to challenge some preconceptions. It wasn't until the late 11th century that it was um, generally considered necessary in the West for priests to be celibate. Priests could be
mhm,
married. Okay.
yeah,
Um, Monks and nuns, not so much. Okay, the ideal was priestly celibacy, but that was seldom achieved. Monks and nuns were supposed to be celibate, but you had a number of monasteries, which is an Eastern phenomenon that you only find in the West, in Britain and Ireland, and in parts of northern France that are connected with us culturally. And
mm,
if you've got men and women living parallel lives in a monastic community, it's always a woman and a Bess who is in charge of both the men and women. And that's because it was considered that women had greater probity, certainly sexual probity, and that they were better placed to make sure that a double monastery functioned as it should, and that men and women lived and worked and collaborated together without engaging in other relationships that were considered inappropriate if you were dedicating your life primarily to the service of God and
mm,
society and humanity as a whole and creation, rather than one other human being and raising children. They did raise children. They raised many children, orphans and others within monasteries. And
yeah,
many of these monasteries were open prisons as well. If you were convicted as a felon in law, you'd have to, as part of that, do your community service, your payback. And you would be attached to a monastery and be expected to do your community service. And so you were inviting some of the most troublesome elements of society into the monastery. So they weren't protecting themselves and withdrawn from it. They were
mm,
actually engaged in recidivism and trying to stop reoffending and to try and actually get people to think about a more responsible way of life. And people didn't always like it. In Bede's History of the English Church and People, there's that one passage where at Teignmouth, a group of monks had got into trouble in a storm as they were trying to get into the mouth of the Tyne. And the peasants there are actually lining up on the cliff, basically saying, "Die, you bastards! You stopped us having, worshipping the old gods and having a fine old time and behaving morally how we considered we could do then, and telling us that there's a different way to be and be more responsible, etc. And now we don't know where we are, and they want them to die. But fortunately, their brethren can run out too and are praying, and the winds drop and they come safe into harbour. But the Bede gives that as an example of the fact that not only were there people in positions of great power who were very opposed to the introduction of a Christian moral ethos, but ordinary people often could find that it limited them. In other senses, it perhaps didn't. I mean, common law marriages had to be considered permissible for a very long period, because if you were living out on the Cumbrian moors, it'd be at least a year before you saw a circuit priest coming round. There
mm,
wasn't a parish system in place then, and so you had to accept that people couldn't be expected to wait, and so they could engage in common law marriages witnessed by their own community. And then when the circuit priest came round, he would then supply the sacrament, and it would become a full Christian marriage. So there's lots of overlap and what have you. And many of the rulers, kings who adopted Christianity in the phase, were assassinated. Um, for example, King Sigebert the Good of Essex and his counterpart of East Anglia, they were both killed. One of them was killed by his bodyguard earlier in the 7th century, and his bodyguard were his own relatives. They were noblemen, they were thanes, had a really strict honour code, and before they were executed, they were asked, "Why did you kill your lord?" That was the worst thing you
mm,
could do as an Anglo-Saxon warrior. And they said, "We had to." He'd gone soft, he'd become Christian, and he forgave his enemies. and the other Sigebert went into a monastery. He gave up his throne and he gave all of his wealth to serve the poor for the monastery to use in its social work. And when all of his relatives had been killed by opponents who were trying to take over the kingdom, he was literally dragged out of the monastery and had to lead his people onto the battlefield. And he went armed not with his sword, but with a wooden cross. He was the first to be cut down. He lost the battle, but he won the war. Essex at that time had apostatized. It had toyed with Christianity and it had given it up. But after his heroic death in front of his people on the battlefield and winning the moral high ground, his territory remained firmly Christian from that point onwards. And, these men and women took big risks. Missionaries to the continent, St. Boniface and others who were cut down. And we still have the book surviving that he held, sacred texts that he held above his head, trying to protect himself from the sword blow. But that book, made by women for him back home in Anglo-Saxon England, nuns were great makers of art and manuscripts as well, had saved him on many an occasion, because the appearance of these things, the processional crosses, the books, etc., and the chant, were things that actually intrigued people. And the beauty of it and the mystery of it were things that actually make them want to know more. And then the use of images in which you could actually use the images to teach them the stories. And they love stories. And telling a good story with a good message really appeals. And then the law codes are refined. They're very good already. Women in this period in Anglo-Saxon England had the best legal rights of any women in the world up to the 1930s. And the earliest abolition movements of abolishing slavery come from Britain and Ireland and other Celtic areas and Anglo-Saxon England in this period. So it's transformative, and it's about not just talking the talk and having the political and other benefits of it. It's about walking the walk, and that's what attracts me to the period.
So if you then had to sum up the Christian mission in the year 670 to 770, say Bede lived 100 years, he didn't, but that's his century.
Yeah.
What would be the 3 words that sum it up?
The 3 words, a trinity of words.
We only ask the easy questions on these interviews.
Hope, sustainability, and faith for a future. That's one concept. And I think those are the underlying things that actually help them weather the storm of the rest of the known world going into a strange phase, as indeed we are now. Certainties are no longer there. Things have been overturned. Nobody knows quite what's coming next. But it is that hope for a future, the sense of identity and the idea of creating sustainable communities and societies, and within that a sense of a degree of social justice. It wasn't, brilliant, but it was a darn sight better than anything anybody had known for many, many centuries, if indeed ever. And so living the Christian ethos, not just talking about it or posing about it, but actually saying this is what we believe, and we're going to put our lives in its service of God and of you, and we're going to put our resources where our mouths are, and also the sheer beauty of it. And they weren't small-minded. If Bede and others could have got hold of any of the works of antiquity, if they thought they were remotely useful, they wouldn't discard them because they were pagan. Bede, for example, uses Pliny a lot in his looking at the natural world and everything. And one of the amazing things he does, our little boy, when he grows up and he's in his late 20s, 30s, is he works out gravitational pull of the moon and writes the first tide timetables. Now, we normally think, that we have to wait for Newton for that. It's not known as gravitational pull, but that's essentially what he did. The fact that we're sitting in 2023 in the Western calendar now is because Bede was a computer. He synthesizes an incredible amount of data about all the different dating systems from around the known world, and he comes up with an incredible system that he's refined from something earlier to actually make that work. And he creates an identity. There was no such thing as Anglo-Saxon or English or Celtic per se at that time, but he begins to get people thinking about who they are, what they want their society to be. That's not necessarily all good as well. He's got his blind spots because he is an Anglo-Saxon, and with all of the violence and all of the misunderstandings and things going on there and all of the tensions, there are human factors as well, but he does what he can to actually get people working together. And at a phase later in his life, when the church is perhaps hardlining a little bit into a hierarchy, he goes into the lists and risks being excommunicated himself to defend Lindisfarne and the Celtic monastic tradition, which he admires so much for its work in community and social justice and its study of scripture and of learning generally, and goes into their defence to try and stop Lindisfarne from being abolished. And he tells bishops politely what their responsibilities are at the end of his life. And the other thing I found in the book that I think is a big contribution is on his deathbed in 735 at Jarrow. Started at Monkwearmouth, died in Jarrow. He spends the last 2 weeks sitting on his cell floor. And his big thing then is that he translates as much as he can of the Gospel of John, what he calls the little gospel that speaks of the things that work of love, into English to share with his own people in their own tongue so that they can better understand it, free of the prejudice that Wycliffe and Tyndale would face when they tried to do the same in the less tolerant late medieval and early modern world. And I think I found Bede's lost translation of John, which puts the translation of any part of the Bible into English back a couple of hundred years to 735 and to Monkwearmouth Jarrow.
Brilliant.
So yeah, these are the sort of things I'm going to be talking about in the lecture, at the Wearmouth Lecture on the 30th. And then I'll be speaking about something else around the subject later that day in Jarrow. And yeah, thank you for having me.
Great. Well, I wonder whether you just want to maybe share something about the book you've got coming out. You've mentioned it a couple of times, but just sort of more specifically, what's the
There's a lot
title?
of
When's it coming out?
information. Okay, well, it's coming out on my birthday on the 1st of October, but I have managed to get them to send me the advance copies. So when I'm giving several lectures. I'm doing the Monkwearmouth one, I'm doing something at Jarrow in the afternoon of the 30th, and I'm doing one for the Newcastle Society of Antiquaries in Newcastle on Wednesday. And so I've got some books with me that I'll sign if anybody wants to buy them. And I'm quite pleased that it's a hardback for £16.95. But it's handleable. It's of a size that you can handle. It's got illustrations, etc. And it's nicely produced, which it helps because the sensory thing, if you're going to handle books, you want them to feel good. Bede would have liked that. And so I'm bringing it up with me when I come. And Bede and the Theory of Everything, because as I say, I think he's made one of the best attempts that I know to actually make sense of time, space, and the relationship of man to the world around it and to eternity and to the creative force, God. So that's why I've called it that. It's got a lot about how he worked in different areas of science, arts, humanities and faith. It's got a lot about what his world was like. And I've tried to write it in such a way, and the people that have read it so far to recommend it say that it's very accessible and approachable. So hopefully it won't just be for academics it'll be the sort of thing that if you've got a real interest and passion for the period, or if you just want to know more about how we got to be where we are, that it might have something in there for you. And it's got beads poetry and other things in there too. So yeah, it's a little bit of personal piety, if you like, for somebody who wrote about the good, the people he admired, the ethos he admired, and the wonder and beauty of the world and creativity, etc. And I like to think of him looking up into the skies above Monkwearmouth and Jarrow when he was up both of them, and thinking about how it all ticks and how little he was, and how big the enormity of all of us together, united as one within the cosmic logos God is. And so even if you're not a person of faith, but you want to understand a bit about the Christian faith and what motivated people not to go out and commit auto-da-fés and persecute others, but to actually put others and a higher ideal of service first, I think it's inspiring. And I'll just tell you, the first words of the book is a quote from Bede. "My chief delight has always been in study, teaching and writing." Now, they're not heroic things for our society, but in this day and age they were, because they were the things that transformed us from hacking each other to pieces on the battlefield and engaging in very unstable relationships of all sorts, not just sexual, but protectionism, extortion, all sorts of things like that, and actually transformed it into a society where men and women and children had a place, where the natural world and its creatures were respected, a great thing from the prehistoric past and from the Celtic tradition. Bede loves all of that. And like Pliny, he believes that truth is beauty. And it's a beautiful ethos. And I hope it's a beautiful book.
Brilliant. Well, there you go. You heard it here first. You can get it before its release date if you come to the lecture in Monkwearmouth or Jarrow, or indeed the talk in Newcastle. And more information about those events will be available in different places. Michelle, thank you ever so much for your time. I think we could talk about Bede and everything for hours and hours and hours and hours. But I think your book
Oh,
will be a fantastic introduction to Bede and his
Tim, thank
life and
you.
his theories of everything.
Thank you. Do you know, I came to, you celebrated last time I was at Monkwearmouth. I came along to a service that you celebrated, loved it. And just on a personal note, we're in the process of moving north.
Oh,
We're
wonderful.
going to be coming back to Northumbria, where my mum's family are from. And so wish us luck and a prayer on that, because we want to come up there as soon as we can, and
It will
going to be
indeed.
taking part in helping to advise on the Northumbrian early church in a spiritual revival of the northern province that Archbishop Stephen is going to be launching soon. So it's called Faith in the North, and I've got faith in the North, and I want to come and be part of it. So
Wonderful. Oh,
yeah.
my dog Dottie finally got herself in the shot. There's her paw.
Yeah, where is she?
Wave
Oh,
goodbye, Dot.
get her in fully. Come on, Dot.
She's a bit. She's hiding now. And I will be celebrating the Eucharist before. Oh, and there's
Lovely.
Diesel. There's the other one. Double death by Labrador. This Eucharist before the Monkwearmouth lecture will be myself as well. So there you go. It's
Lovely. And that's 10 o'clock on the 30th for the
10
Eucharist
o'clock on
and
the
11
30th
o'clock for the lecture.
and 11 for the lecture. Wonderful. So there we are.
I look forward to seeing some of you then, and thank you if you have listening.
Bye.
See you then, Tim. Take care now.